Welcome back to DriveDriverDriven. I'm Humble, and we're back on the Zero project today. Got a few big updates that I didn't get on camera because we were busy wrestling, but some of you may have seen in the last video, the Ultima crate has arrived. We already did an unpacking and an inventory, and there was a few things missing. So we're waiting on that, but everything's buttoned back up for storage while we get the Zero underway and hopefully finish sooner than later. As far as the Zero goes, hey, the engine's in the car. Not just the engine, but the engine, transmission, the drive shaft, got the shifter in place, the dash loosely fitted, seats and belts. Again, seats aren't bolted in yet because I wanted to show you a few things, but the belts are in, and thus begins a few of our 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. So this is the factory Ford alternator, and usually it fits right in this area here. Now, it will fit inside the Zero chassis and the narrower standard chassis that I have, but you can't use these long bolts for the alternator because even if I loosely put this in place, you can see there's no way to get the alternator in there. So you just have to use a bolt like this and send it through with the alternator in, sort of loosely fitted, and then you bolt it up. That was the first problem, and the reason I've left that out is because the second problem we discovered is if I move that out of the way, this is the bleed and feed pipe for our clutch. And if you look down there, we have just barely enough room to slide that guy in. And normally it'll sit in this kind of orientation. The problem is I can't actually lift it up enough to put on the slave cylinder. So I can put it in the hole, I just can't fit it on top of the slave cylinder. So what I have to do is lift up the whole car, pull off the engine mounts, lower the engine and transmission so I can get that pipe back in, raise everything back so it's in the right position, and then put our mounts back on. And then I'll be able to cut our clutch feed pipe to length, and then I have a different fitting than this one that comes on the ATR, which will be a 90 degree, and so this guy will basically just slide right over and mount somewhere over here. So I'm gonna have to chop about 8 inches or so out of this guy. Once that's done, and I don't need to move the engine and transmission anymore, I can put our intake on, I can put our starter on, I can basically fit the last of the ancillaries onto the engine. Another problem I discovered is our cam sensor. This is a 2-pin connector, but our cam sensor is actually a 3-pin. So I've been trying to source a cam sensor for an earlier motor. I think this is a 2008 or a 2009, but what I need is the sensor from 2006 or 2007 to work with this 2-pin setup. Otherwise, there's only one other sensor I need to sort, and that is an oil pressure sensor, which will fit down here in the Mountoon plate. And then our engine electrical will be good. For our breather setup, again, move this out of the way. What I'm planning to do is utilize this factory PCV pipe, and I don't want to run it over the top like this. what I'll end up doing is probably cutting this pipe here and then routing it forward along with these guys up to a catch can on the front of the engine. And then from our catch can, I'll also feed our PCV off the block. And then that will run to our intake, which is going to be here using the old fuel injector ports. And I'll get to that in a project later. I've started sizing up our front fenders and how to mount them. I think I've shown it before. Down underneath here, basically right underneath where this yoke is, there is the tail mount for the transmission. And I cannot tighten that with the drive shaft in place. There's no way to get your hand or tools around in there. And there's not enough of an opening to get any kind of wrench in there either. So what I have to do, and this is going to be a pain, is I have to undo the drive shaft at the rear, drop the rear differential out, pull the drive shaft out, tighten our bolt, and then put everything back in again. These are just some of the problems you see, or you discover rather, when assembling a car and figuring out the order of operations. So basically the goal for today is I want to get our clutch feed and bleed pipe in, which is the engine lowering and all that. Once that's back into place, then we'll go to the rear of the car, drop the rear diff out, undo the drive shaft, and get underneath there. And then our drivetrain, our engine and transmission, will be final mounted into the car. Once everything's back together with the drive shaft and the rear diff, we can put our axles in, and then our drivetrain will be complete. There's quite a few steps there. It's probably going to be a bit of a time lapse, but I'm getting an early start in the morning so I don't run out of steam once we get into the heat of the day. So with that, let's get going. So the engine is in, got the engine mounts torqued down, dropped everything, and got our clutch pipe in. And as you can see, it is a very tight fit, but it does fit. The downside to this situation is, in order to remove this, I have to separate the engine and transmission. Bummer. But my goal with doing this was that this is a fire and forget. So once we get this trimmed, this is in place, I shouldn't have to worry about this piece anymore. The clearance issue I talked about before is actually right down in here. So this is normally where our clutch fork would stick out, and it impacts the chassis right down here. There's a couple tricks you can do to shorten this arm and basically just bang the hell out of the chassis here to make room. But I thought this was a more simple and elegant solution. Let's see. So now what I want to do is get the exhaust on, actually. Alternator's a bust for now because I only have one bolt long enough. But I did want to test fit the exhaust check a couple of things. One was to see if I could still get the alternator in without taking the exhaust on and off. And I think I can. I can either squeeze it through the front, or I might even be able to get it through this window here and then push it forward. I'll still be able to reach all the bolts for the alternator, which is good, with the exhaust on. So I can service the alternator without removing the exhaust, which is good to know. Couple things that worry me is just the proximity of this coolant pipe to the exhaust here. And then down below, you can see it's a lot tighter than it used to be down here on the chassis, but I can still barely get my finger in there. And that's because I removed the spacers that used to sit under the engine mounts. Part of that was to fit the clutch feed and bleed tube, so that would fit. But the other is because the top of the valve cover would hit the underside of the engine lid. It's just that tight. There's that little clearance up front. So those had to go, which meant that the exhaust sits lower now. And what I'm thinking about is actually wrapping the exhaust from the flange up to here, or where these 4 tubes connect here, just to minimize heat transfer to this coolant pipe. The other thing I might do is actually put some of that gold heat shield here on the bottom of the pipe, or even the silver wrap, just to keep extra heat out of that pipe. I don't know if it's an issue. If anyone's got one of these cars that can elaborate a bit, it'd be great. But I think that'll be okay if I just do a little more heat shielding here and then protect the chassis here. But other than that, I'm not ready to call the exhaust final mounted yet. I cinched up a couple of the exhaust nuts just so I could set the final position here and tighten up our exhaust clamp there. So far so good. We do have clearance. Everything's looking sharp there. Next is we're going to move to the back of the car so that I can pull the bolts out of the drive shaft there and then drop the rear differential so that we can finally tighten up the last of our drivetrain bolts here underneath the nose of the transmission. I think the camera shut off some point in there early on because the battery died, even though I had it charging. But we have the bolt done up here. I did have to pull the rear diff out. So back here, there's a couple of bolts up in here, and these two up on top that hold to this cross member. And basically all I had to do was remove these two bolts up in the front, pop these two bolts out, and then I could pull the diff out and backwards, and that gave me enough room to get the drive shaft out of the way, and then I could do that bolt up underneath the nose of the transmission. And then it was putting everything back as it was, putting the drive shaft back in, the diff back in. While I had the diff out, though, you can sort of see it here. There was some aluminum spacers, look like this guy. And what this does is it sits between the differential and this top crossbar to set the height of the differential correctly and to set the angle of the nose correctly. Now, I didn't need these previously because I was going to run the spacers up in front on the engine. And so that would set the angle more like this. And then on the flip side, the diff needed to sit at an angle more like this in order to make the drive shaft happy. Basically, you need to make sure that the angle of the nose of the transmission like this meets the same angle of the nose of your differential, like so. And so when the two pieces go in, even though it might look like your drive shaft is off kilter, by a degree or two, not an egregious amount, but just a little bit. But that's what it needs for these U-joints to be happy. So because we removed the spacers in front, that means that I needed to add spacers in the rear just because of how the angles worked out. So I only needed 2 of these guys. I made 3 just in case. And so we got that popped in. The other thing I did really quick is there is a trim piece right here. And it's just a piece of angle, and it's actually held in place by the belts here, by the brackets that hold the belts down. And it just pushes in, and it's held firmly by these brackets here. And it's just a friction fit, that's all. And it's a nice little trim piece that goes across, and it hides where the end of the carpet and everything else meet up here. Normally that would sit up front underneath this kind of half moon shape here that we're missing out of the carbon. Next up is, well, there's a few things now that we need to do. We need to get on our fuel system over here. This is our fuel reservoir and pump assembly. This is actually the one that used to be in the Ultima, and we're changing the way the Ultima fuel plumbing is situated. So I no longer needed this in the Ultima. The Zero has a design similar to this, except for the pump and the reservoir assembly are separate. This is an 034 pump with a Bosch 044 Motorsport pump inside that picks up at the very bottom here. And what I want to do is put this right up here against the firewall, right behind where the pedals are, so all of our fuel plumbing can come in on this side down to our high pressure pump. It'll come up to our fuel rail, back down around through our regulator, and then down and back out to the back of the car. Speaking of the back of the car, set this back down. We have this assembly, another part donated from the Ultima. So this was the old lift pump that sat down underneath near the fuel tanks. Luckily, the one that did not catch fire, or caught less fire, I guess you could say. Pump still works fine, nice and clean. I found this XRP 100 micron filter that just screws into the end of it, so that really simplifies our pump assembly. So this will go to our lower fuel outlet on the tank, and then up here is a -6 that will feed our sump tank in the front that I just showed you, and this is our low pressure pump, but again, it's another Bosch 044 Motorsport pump because that's what we were running in the Ultima. What I need to do now is actually get those fuel pumps in place and get our fuel system situated, because the goal is to try and start this car next weekend, assuming we get all the parts we need. So let's get onto the fuel system. And then over and under. And then onto our fuel rail. And there we go. So now that's nice and out of the way. It's relatively hidden underneath there. The return, or rather the other side here, goes underneath to our fuel pressure regulator here, which I still need to tighten up. Out of the bottom, this will have to go back to our sump tank here, and I got to find a good method to do that. There's only 2 ports on the top of this thing, and I need a third. But what I might do is just tee one of these connections so that I can run the return and the return back to the tank off of a single line. And that'll keep things nice and sweet. Otherwise, our fuel system is just about done. I've already run these 2 lines which go back to the tank. I can sort of crawl under here and show you what it looks like. So if you look, there's our supply line and return line from the tank itself. Our feed line goes over to that nice filter and the 044 pump. Then that line comes all the way back up to the front. Our return line comes up and down the tunnel, and then up and under and back up to the top of the tank. Another thing I want to show you is GBS include these kind of nylon plastic hoses as part of their fuel system solution. I'm not a fan of these. I think it's just a little too exposed and unprotected. I know a lot of builders use these without issue. I wasn't comfortable with it, and I wanted to run my own hoses. So I'm just going to trim these, and I've secured our hoses to these through the tunnel just for additional support. But these I'm going to cut and get rid of. All right, before we call it, there was one other thing that I wanted to show you guys that I was just super happy with, and that is this kind of console cover or steering column cover for, I think this is an NB1 Miata. So it didn't fit normally in front of the dash. It has to be trimmed, and pull this up, and you can see it still needs a little bit of cleanup work, but I've cut it and trimmed it, a little bit of filing. It didn't need a whole lot of work, but this guy slots right into place now. And it doesn't latch as well on this side, and I got to figure that out. But otherwise, it's a nice, clean, perfect fit on the dash here, and I'm just really, really happy with how that turned out. I've been thinking about different coverings for this piece, whether to do a like an Alcantara or a leather or leatherette, but my biggest worry is just how it's going to hold up in the sun, because, well, this particular piece is just going to be exposed constantly to UV and sunlight, so, and weather and everything else in general. So I'm just wondering if there's anyone has an idea of, I guess, the best material to try and cover this. Let me know. But otherwise, it's just a perfect fit in there. And then soon enough, we can get our wheel put back on. If I can get the splines to line up. There we go. And you can see how it fits really nicely back there. I still need to cut all the holes for our gauges and everything, do a little bit more work behind the dash, but this was important because I need to see where this part sits so that I could decide where my two main gauges will sit, and then the 4 or 5 auxiliary gauges here in the middle. Another interior piece that we'll need to sort out is the cover that comes here across the middle. We have to drill a couple of holes for our shifter for this kind of a bar extension, so that this piece can poke through and this piece can poke through, and then this bar linkage, it will actually sit on top of the plate that sits here. So that's going to take some precision measurement, I'm sure. So I mean, other than that, we're getting really close now. There's a whole gaggle of parts that's going to arrive tomorrow to finish up the fuel system. I've got a couple of missing sensors, or rather the correct sensors now that will show up. And hopefully we can get this engine started next weekend. That's sort of my goal, and the reason I'm rushing the particular projects that I'm rushing on is we're really down to the nitty-gritty. There's only a couple things here and there that are left. And then the rest is cosmetic, really. Things like our splash guards or stone guards for the rear arches, getting the front arches on, cutting a hole in the top of the hood, rather, to clear the exhaust. All of these things are basically beauty projects, and all of the really hard work is already done. So before we can get it started, we're going to need to hook up our electrical, get our battery mounted, and do our first smoke test. And hopefully that can happen this week before the weekend. So a couple big projects, but I think we can get them knocked out. So I think that's going to do it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.